My parents tried to regain control over me by deception and forged documents as if I had a child, and I sued them, and I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business. My parents, Richard and Linda, were not what you'd call the warm and loving type. They were more like, well, monsters disguised as people. From as early as I can remember, they never showed me any affection. I was an only child, and instead of cherishing me, they treated me like a burden, a mistake that they had to tolerate. My earliest memories are filled with their constant arguing. I remember hiding under my bed, pressing my hands over my ears to block out the sounds of them yelling at each other, and sometimes at me. They fought over everything: money, work, the house. But most of all, they fought over me. My mother would often scream at my father, saying that he should have taken better precautions so I wouldn't exist. My father would yell back, saying it was her fault for keeping me when she had the chance to get rid of the problem. Imagine hearing that as a child. Their words cut deep, and as a result, I grew up feeling like I was a mistake, something to be ashamed of. I tried to be invisible, to stay out of their way as much as possible. But that didn't stop them from finding reasons to belittle and punish me. If I brought home a bad grade, my mother would scream at me, calling me stupid and useless. If I did well, my father would accuse me of cheating because there was no way a kid like you could ever achieve anything on your own. Physical punishment was also part of the package. My father believed in the old, spare the rod, spoil the child nonsense, and he made sure I was disciplined regularly. The beatings weren't severe enough to leave visible marks that others could see, but they were bad enough to leave scars, both physically and mentally. I remember one time when I was around 8, I accidentally knocked over a vase that had been a wedding gift to my parents. My father didn't just punish me. He made me kneel on rice for hours afterward as a lesson about being careful. My knees bled, but I didn't cry. I learned early on that crying only made things worse. School wasn't much of a refuge either. I was that weird, quiet kid who never talked and always sat in the back. I didn't have friends. Most of the other kids either ignored me or bullied me. The teachers didn't care enough to notice what was going on at home or that I was withdrawing further into myself every day. I spent most of my time at school daydreaming about escaping, about running away and never coming back. But I had nowhere to go, and the world outside my small town seemed even more terrifying than the hell I was living in. I was about 12 years old when I met Jake. It was during a particularly miserable recess period. I was sitting under a tree, eating my lunch alone as usual, when this tall, lanky kid with a mop of curly brown hair plopped down beside me. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, munching on his sandwich. After a few minutes, he looked over at me and said, "You don't talk much, do you?" I was startled. No one ever talked to me unless it was to make fun of me. I didn't know what to say, so I just shrugged. Jake grinned and said, "That's okay. I can talk enough for both of us." And talk he did. He went on and on about how much he hated school, how he thought the teachers were idiots, and how he was sure his parents were space aliens because of how weird they were. I didn't respond much, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel completely alone. Jake was different from the other kids. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't an outcast either. He had this easygoing confidence that made people like him, even if they didn't fully understand him. And for some reason, he decided that I was going to be his friend. He started sitting with me every day at lunch, inviting me over to his house after school, and including me in his weekend plans. At first, I was suspicious. I thought it was some kind of trick. But Jake wasn't like that. He didn't care that I was quiet or that I was weird. He just liked me for who I was, and that was something I wasn't used to. Jake's family was the polar opposite of mine. His parents, Carol and Tom, were warm, loving, and welcoming. Their house was full of laughter, the smell of home-cooked meals, and the kind of chaos that comes from having 3 kids running around. Jake had an older brother, Mike, who was off at college, and a younger sister, Emily, who was still in elementary school. Whenever I was at their house, I felt like I was in a different world. Tom would ruffle my hair and call me kiddo, and Carol always made sure there was an extra plate at the table for me, no matter how short the notice. It was in their home that I first experienced what a real family was supposed to feel like. Jake and I became inseparable. He was the first person I ever opened up to about my parents. I'll never forget the look on his face when I told him about the beatings, the insults, the constant feeling of being unwanted. He didn't know what to say at first, but then he just nodded and said, "Well, that sucks, man. But you're not alone anymore. You've got me." We made a pact that day. We promised each other that no matter what happened, we'd stick together. We both dreamed of getting out of that small town and making something of ourselves. Jake was smart, smarter than most people gave him credit for. He had this knack for seeing the big picture, for understanding how things worked in a way that went beyond what they taught in school. He was the one who first suggested we go to college together. As we got older, we started talking seriously about our future. Jake was passionate about marketing. He loved the idea of understanding what made people tick and how to use that to sell products or ideas. I didn't have a clear direction at the time, but Jake's enthusiasm was contagious. He convinced me that marketing was the way to go, that we could make a real difference in the world if we worked together. So we set our sights on getting into a good university with a strong marketing program. High school was a blur of late-night study sessions, part-time jobs, and trying to survive the minefield of teenage life. Jake and I were still best friends, but as we got closer to graduation, things started to get complicated. There was this girl, Emily. No, not Jake's sister, another Emily. She was smart, funny, and beautiful, and both Jake and I fell for her hard. It was the first time our friendship was truly tested. I'd never been in a relationship before, and to be honest, I didn't think I deserved one. But Emily was different. She actually seemed to like me. She'd laugh at my jokes, seek me out in the hallways, and we'd spend hours talking about everything and nothing. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could be happy with someone. But there was a problem. Jake liked her too. I didn't want to come between him and the first real friendship I'd ever had, so I kept my feelings to myself. But then something shocking happened that changed everything. One day, out of the blue, Emily asked me out. I was floored. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to say yes, but I was terrified of what it would do to my friendship with Jake. I tried to talk to him about it, but he brushed it off, saying he wasn't serious about her. He told me to go for it if I liked her, but there was something in his eyes that made me hesitate. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying, that he was just saying what he thought he should say. Despite my reservations, I said yes to Emily. For a few weeks, it was like I was living in a dream. We'd go out, hold hands, and talk for hours. She made me feel things I'd never felt before, things I didn't even know I was capable of feeling. But the whole time, there was this gnawing guilt in the pit of my stomach. Every time I saw Jake, I could tell he was hurting, no matter how hard he tried to hide it. Things came to a head one night at a party. Emily and I had been dating for about a month, and Jake had been distant the whole time. We were all at this big end-of-year bash at one of the popular kids' houses. There was a lot of drinking, loud music, and the kind of teenage drama that comes with that. At some point in the night, I lost track of Emily. I looked around for her, but I couldn't find her anywhere. That's when I saw Jake, sitting alone in the backyard, a bottle of something strong in his hand. I went over to him, and we sat in silence for a while. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked him what was wrong. He looked at me with this mix of anger and sadness and said, "You know what's wrong." He started talking about how he'd always liked Emily, how he thought they had something special, and how he couldn't believe I'd betrayed him like that. I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. I tried to apologize, but Jake wasn't having it. He said something that stuck with me. "I thought we were in this together, but I guess I was wrong. You were just looking out for yourself the whole time." Those words cut deep. I realized that, in a way, he was right. I'd been so wrapped up in my own feelings, my own happiness, that I hadn't considered what it might be doing to him. The guilt was overwhelming. I tried to explain that I hadn't meant to hurt him, that I didn't know how serious he was about Emily. But Jake just shook his head and walked away, leaving me there in the dark, alone. That night marked a turning point in our friendship. Things were never the same after that. We still hung out, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. I broke up with Emily shortly after. I couldn't stand the thought of losing Jake completely, but the damage was done. We both applied to the same university, as planned, but the excitement we once shared about our future had been replaced with an awkward tension. When we got to college, things didn't get any easier. We ended up rooming together, which, in hindsight, was probably a mistake. The rift between us only grew as we tried to navigate the new challenges of university life. I threw myself into my studies, hoping to distract myself from the mess I'd made of our friendship. Jake, on the other hand, started partying hard. He made new friends, ones who were into the same wild lifestyle he was adopting. We grew further and further apart, and soon we were barely speaking. One night, something happened that I still can't fully wrap my head around. Jake came back to our dorm room late, really late. He was drunk, more than I'd ever seen him before. He stumbled in, slurring his words, and started ranting about how everything had gone wrong, how he'd lost everything that mattered. I tried to calm him down, but he wasn't having it. He started throwing things, books, clothes, anything he could get his hands on. Then, out of nowhere, he collapsed on the floor, sobbing. I didn't know what to do. I'd never seen Jake like this, so broken, so vulnerable. I sat down beside him, not saying anything, just letting him cry. Eventually, he started talking, his words tumbling out in a drunken haze. He talked about how he felt like he was spiraling, how he didn't know who he was anymore. He admitted that he still hadn't gotten over Emily, that he'd been pretending to be okay when he wasn't. And then he said something that shocked me to my core. He confessed that he'd thought about ending it all. Hearing those words made my blood run cold. I'd known Jake was struggling, but I had no idea it was that bad. I begged him to get help, to talk to someone who could actually do something about it. But he just laughed bitterly and said there was no point. He didn't think anyone could help him. Not me, not a therapist, no one. I stayed up with him that whole night, afraid that if I let him out of my sight, he might do something drastic. The next morning, when he was sober, I tried to bring it up again, but he brushed it off, saying he'd just been drunk and emotional, that it wasn't a big deal. But I knew better. I could see the darkness in his eyes, the way he was barely holding it together. That was the moment I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand by and watch my best friend destroy himself. I reached out to one of our professors, a guy named Dr. Stevens, who I'd heard was good with students going through tough times. I didn't tell him everything, but I gave him enough of the story that he understood Jake was in trouble. Dr. Stevens was amazing. He started inviting Jake to his office hours, under the guise of mentorship. At first, Jake resisted. He didn't want anyone prying into his life. But over time, he started opening up. Slowly but surely, he began to turn things around. He cut back on the partying, started focusing more on his studies, and even started seeing a counselor. It wasn't a quick fix, nothing ever is, but he was taking steps in the right direction. As Jake began to heal, our friendship started to mend as well. It wasn't like it was before, but it was something. We started hanging out more, talking about our future plans, and even working on some projects together. We both ended up majoring in marketing, just like we'd planned. Jake had this incredible ability to come up with ideas that were so out of the box that they blew everyone away. I was more grounded, better at the practical side of things, so we balanced each other out well. So let's pick up where I left off: college. Jake and I were finally starting to get back on track, and Emily and I had gone our separate ways. But the tension that hung over our friendship never really disappeared. We were both studying marketing, and while we were good at it, college life wasn't exactly cheap. I was on a tight budget, trying to stretch every dollar I could. Jake, despite his family being relatively well off, was still dealing with the fallout from his earlier struggles. He had racked up a lot of debt from his wild days, and it was catching up to him. One day, Emily, yes, the same Emily who had come between Jake and me, approached me with an idea. We'd started talking again, not as anything romantic, but as friends. She was in a similar financial situation, working part-time jobs that barely covered her living expenses. Emily was sharp, driven, and had a knack for spotting opportunities. She noticed that a lot of students, especially underclassmen, were struggling with their coursework and were willing to pay for help. And that's when she pitched the idea to me. What if we started selling homework and offering tutoring services to make some extra cash? At first, I was hesitant. It seemed risky, not to mention unethical. But Emily was persuasive. She pointed out that we weren't just handing out answers. We'd be helping students understand the material. It was a gray area, sure, but it wasn't like we were running a full-on cheating operation. Besides, we were both broke, and this seemed like an easy way to make some serious money. So, we started small. We offered to write essays, complete assignments, and even prepare study guides for other students. At first, we charged $50 per essay or assignment, depending on the complexity. Word spread quickly, and before we knew it, we had more clients than we could handle. We expanded our services, offering personalized tutoring sessions for $75 an hour. Some students were willing to pay even more if it meant a guaranteed good grade. The money started pouring in. In a matter of months, I was pulling in nearly $1,500 a week, way more than I'd ever imagined. Jake found out about our little side hustle and, surprisingly, he wasn't upset. In fact, he wanted in. We brought him on board to help with the tutoring sessions. Jake had a way of explaining things that made even the most complicated concepts seem simple, and students loved him for it. With the three of us working together, the business grew even more. It wasn't long before we were making enough money to live comfortably. We upgraded our dorm rooms to a nicer off-campus apartment, bought new laptops, and even started going out more. Life was good. But as with everything in my life, things didn't stay simple for long. One night, Emily and I were hanging out at our apartment, counting the money we'd made that week. Over $6,000 in cash, no less. It felt surreal. We were just college students, and we were raking in more money than most of our professors. But with that money came a new set of problems. For one, we were constantly looking over our shoulders, paranoid that someone might find out what we were doing. We knew that if the university caught wind of our operation, we'd be expelled, no questions asked. And then there was Jake. As much as he'd helped our business thrive, I could tell he was still struggling. He'd started drinking again, not as heavily as before, but enough that I noticed. He also became increasingly reckless with the money we were making. He'd blow through hundreds of dollars in a single night, buying drinks for everyone at the bar or splurging on expensive clothes he didn't need. It was like he was trying to fill some void inside himself, but no matter how much money he spent, it never seemed to be enough. One night, after a particularly wild party, Jake and I were sitting on the roof of our apartment building, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He was drunk, really drunk, and he started talking about how he felt like he was living on borrowed time. He said that no matter how much money we made, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all going to come crashing down eventually. "I've been thinking," Jake slurred, "what if we just take off? You know, leave all this behind and start fresh somewhere else. We've got the money. We could do it." I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just the booze talking. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. We were making good money, but we were living with a constant cloud of anxiety hanging over our heads. We were always one mistake away from losing everything. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe we needed a fresh start. Over the next few weeks, Jake kept bringing up the idea of leaving. Emily, who was usually the voice of reason, surprised me by agreeing with him. She was tired of the stress, the secrecy, and the fear of getting caught. She wanted more freedom, more opportunities, more control over her life. We all did. So, we started making plans. We decided that after graduation, we'd leave the country and start over somewhere new. It was a crazy idea, but the more we talked about it, the more it seemed like the right thing to do. We settled on a destination, Australia. None of us had ever been there, but it seemed like the perfect place to reinvent ourselves. Plus, the marketing industry was booming there, and we figured we could use our skills to make a name for ourselves. We spent the next few months preparing for our escape. We funneled our earnings into offshore accounts, sold off our belongings, and tied up any loose ends. By the time graduation rolled around, we were ready. We didn't tell anyone our plans, not our families, not our friends. We just packed our bags, bought one-way tickets, and left. Arriving in Australia was like stepping into a new world. The air was different, the people were different, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. We rented a small apartment in Sydney and immediately started looking for work. It wasn't easy at first. No one knew who we were, and we didn't have the connections that we'd had back in the States. But we were determined, and we had money to keep us afloat until we found our footing. Jake, with his natural charm and way with words, landed a job at a marketing firm within a few weeks. Emily and I followed soon after. We were finally doing what we'd set out to do, building careers in marketing. The money wasn't as good as what we'd been making in college, but it was enough to live comfortably. More importantly, it was legal, and we didn't have to constantly look over our shoulders. But just when it seemed like things were settling down, life threw another curveball at us. Jake had been working at the marketing firm for about 6 months when he met a woman named Charlotte. She was a client, an up-and-coming entrepreneur with big ideas and an even bigger personality. She was smart, driven, and ambitious. Everything Jake was drawn to. They started spending a lot of time together, both professionally and personally, and it wasn't long before they were dating. At first, I was happy for Jake. He seemed genuinely happy with Charlotte, and she brought out the best in him. But then I started noticing some red flags. Charlotte was incredibly controlling. She wanted to know where Jake was at all times, who he was with, and what he was doing. She even started showing up at our apartment unannounced, just to check in on him. It was suffocating, and it was taking a toll on Jake. One night, after a particularly heated argument with Charlotte, Jake showed up at our apartment, looking more lost than I'd ever seen him. He confessed that Charlotte had been pressuring him to marry her. She wanted to combine their businesses and build an empire together. But Jake wasn't ready for that. He wasn't even sure he wanted to be with her anymore, but he felt trapped. She had a way of manipulating him, making him feel like he owed her something. Emily and I tried to convince Jake to break things off with Charlotte, but he was afraid of what she might do. She had connections, powerful ones, and he didn't want to cross her. But the longer he stayed with her, the more miserable he became. It was like watching someone slowly drown, and there was nothing we could do to save him. Things finally came to a head one night when Jake didn't come home. We tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The next morning, we got a call from the police. Jake had been in a car accident. He'd been driving drunk and had crashed into a tree on the outskirts of the city. He was alive, but barely. He'd sustained serious injuries and was in a coma. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt like I'd failed him, like I should have done more to help him, to get him away from Charlotte. Before things got this bad, Emily was devastated. She blamed herself, saying that if we hadn't dragged Jake into our crazy plan to leave the country, maybe none of this would have happened. For weeks, we visited Jake in the hospital, hoping and praying that he'd wake up. But as time passed, the doctors became less optimistic. They said that even if he did wake up, there was a good chance he'd never be the same again. The thought of losing Jake, of losing the person who had been like a brother to me, was unbearable. While Jake was in the hospital, Emily and I tried to keep things together. We threw ourselves into our work, trying to distract ourselves from the reality of the situation. But it was hard. Every day was a reminder of how fragile life was, how quickly everything could fall apart. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, Charlotte showed up at our apartment. She was a mess, disheveled, tear-streaked, and clearly drunk. She started screaming at us, blaming us for what had happened to Jake. She said that we'd ruined his life, that we'd turned him into something he wasn't. I tried to calm her down, but she wasn't listening. She started throwing things, breaking anything she could get her hands on. Emily tried to intervene, but Charlotte turned on her, shoving her into a wall. That was the last straw. I called the police, and they took Charlotte away, kicking and screaming. It was a nightmare, and it only added to the chaos that had taken over our lives. A few days later, Jake's condition took a turn for the worse. The doctors called us in and told us that he wasn't going to make it. They said that we should prepare ourselves to say goodbye. I was in shock. I couldn't believe that this was happening, that Jake was really going to die. We sat by his bedside, holding his hand and telling him how much he meant to us. I told him that he was like a brother to me, that I was sorry for everything that had happened. Emily was sobbing, telling Jake that she loved him, that she wished she could go back and do things differently. And then, just like that, Jake was gone. The doctors turned off the machines, and the room went silent. I felt like a part of me had died with him. After Jake's death, everything changed. Emily and I were lost, struggling to find meaning in a world that had suddenly become dark and empty. We kept working, kept going through the motions, but nothing felt the same. The money, the success, the escape, it all felt hollow without Jake. Eventually, we decided that we needed a fresh start. We couldn't stay in Sydney, surrounded by memories of Jake and the life we tried to build. So, we sold everything we owned, packed our bags, and left Australia. We ended up in Thailand, of all places. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, a chance to disappear into a place where no one knew us. We found work at a small marketing agency, nothing like the high-profile jobs we'd had in Sydney, but it was enough to get by. For a while, things were quiet. We lived in a small apartment in Bangkok, working during the day and spending our evenings trying to forget the past. But the ghosts of what had happened still haunted us, and no matter how far we ran, we couldn't escape them. One night, after a few too many drinks, Emily and I got into a heated argument. She blamed me for what had happened to Jake, saying that if I hadn't pushed him into our plan to leave the country, he might still be alive. I fired back, saying that it wasn't my fault, that we'd all made our choices, and that Jake had been a grown man who could make his own decisions. But the truth was, I did blame myself. I blamed myself for dragging Jake into the mess that had ultimately led to his death. I blamed myself for not doing more to save him from Charlotte, for not seeing the signs earlier. And I knew that Emily was right in some ways. I had been the one who'd pushed us to leave, who'd convinced Jake to take the risk. After that night, things between Emily and me were never the same. We drifted apart, each of us dealing with our guilt and grief in our own way. We still worked together, but there was a wall between us that we couldn't break down. Then, out of the blue, I got an offer from a large marketing firm in Singapore. They'd heard about some of the work I'd done in Sydney and wanted to bring me on board. It was a dream opportunity, but it meant leaving Emily behind. I agonized over the decision for days. I didn't want to leave Emily alone, especially after everything we'd been through together. But at the same time, I knew that staying in Bangkok wasn't doing either of us any good. We were stuck in a rut, haunted by the past, and I needed to get out before it consumed me. In the end, I took the job. I left Emily a letter, explaining that I needed to move on, that I hoped she would find peace and happiness in whatever path she chose. And then I left, heading to Singapore to start a new chapter in my life. The years that followed were a blur of work and success. I climbed the ranks at the marketing firm, eventually becoming one of their top executives. I made more money than I'd ever dreamed of, traveled the world, and lived the high life. But no matter how much I achieved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I tried to reach out to Emily a few times, but she never responded. Eventually, I stopped trying, figuring that she'd moved on with her life. I hoped she was happy, wherever she was. Years passed, and I settled into a routine. I made friends, dated casually, but nothing ever felt permanent. I tried to convince myself that I was happy, that I didn't need anything more. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. One day, out of the blue, I got an email from Emily. I hadn't heard from her in years, and seeing her name in my inbox sent a shock through my system. I hesitated before opening the message, unsure of what to expect. My hands were shaking as I clicked on it. The email was short, just a few sentences, but it was enough to throw my world off balance. Emily wrote that she'd been thinking about me a lot lately, that she missed our friendship, and that she wanted to reconnect. She asked if I was still in Singapore and if we could meet up. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity before replying. I told her that I was still in Singapore and that I'd love to see her. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. A week later, Emily arrived in Singapore. Seeing her again was like stepping back in time. She looked the same, yet different, more mature, more grounded. We hugged awkwardly, both of us unsure of how to navigate the years that had passed between us. But as we sat down to catch up over coffee, the old familiarity started to return. Emily told me that after I left Bangkok, she'd struggled to find her footing. She'd bounced around from job to job, never really settling down. But eventually, she discovered her passion for art and opened a small gallery in Chiang Mai. It wasn't a huge success, but it was enough to make a living and bring her some sense of purpose. She'd been doing well, but she admitted that she still felt lonely, that something was missing in her life too. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I spent a lot of time together. It was like we were rediscovering our friendship all over again. But this time there was something more between us, something deeper. We were both older, wiser, and more aware of the fragility of life. It didn't take long for our friendship to evolve into something romantic. One night, as we were sitting on the balcony of my apartment, looking out over the city lights, Emily told me that she wanted to stay in Singapore. She was tired of drifting from place to place and wanted to build a life somewhere she could call home. She asked if I'd help her open a new art gallery in the city, and I agreed without hesitation. It felt like the perfect way to start the next chapter of our lives. We found a beautiful space in a trendy part of town, and within a few months, Emily's gallery was up and running. She poured her heart and soul into it, curating exhibitions that drew crowds and critical acclaim. I was so proud of her, and it felt good to be part of something meaningful again. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building a real future. And then, something happened that changed everything. Emily found out she was pregnant. We hadn't planned for it, but the news was a shock in the best possible way. Emily was overjoyed, and so was I. After everything we'd been through, the idea of starting a family together felt like a gift, a chance to finally have the kind of happiness that had always seemed out of reach. We decided to get married before the baby arrived. It wasn't a big wedding, just a small ceremony with a few close friends, but it was perfect. For the first time in my life, I felt truly content. But as always, life had other plans. Unbeknownst to us, my parents, Richard and Linda, had been keeping tabs on me all these years. We hadn't spoken since I left for Australia, and I'd done everything I could to distance myself from them. But they were resourceful, and when they found out through a mutual acquaintance that I was living in Singapore, they decided to track me down. I didn't find out until much later, but they hired a private detective to dig into my life. They learned about Emily, about our marriage, and most importantly, about the baby. That's when they put their plan into motion. One evening, Emily and I were having dinner at home when there was a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was surprised to find my parents standing there when I opened it. My heart sank. I hadn't seen them in years, and I had no interest in rekindling our relationship, but they pushed their way inside, insisting that they just wanted to talk. Emily, who had never met my parents, was polite and welcoming. She didn't know the history between us, and I didn't want to upset her, so I let them in. We sat in the living room, making awkward small talk, but I could tell something was off. My parents were being unusually nice, too nice. It felt like they were trying to butter us up for something, and I was on edge the entire time. After they left, I told Emily about my childhood, about the way my parents had treated me, and why I'd cut them out of my life. She was shocked, but she understood why I'd been so cold toward them. We agreed that we wouldn't let them back into our lives, no matter what. But my parents weren't going to give up that easily. They started showing up unannounced, trying to insert themselves into our lives. They'd bring gifts for the baby, offer to help out with the gallery, and even suggested that we move back to the States so we could be closer to family. I refused every time, but Emily, who was trying to be nice, kept giving them the benefit of the doubt. That's when things took a dark turn. My parents started manipulating Emily behind my back. They'd wait until I was at work and then drop by the gallery to chat. They'd tell her stories about how much they loved me, how they regretted everything that had happened in the past, and how they just wanted to be part of our lives again. Emily, who was naturally trusting and empathetic, started to believe them. She didn't know the extent of their cruelty, and they took advantage of that. One day, Emily came home with a strange look on her face. She told me that my parents had made her an offer. They wanted to invest in her gallery, to help her expand and take it to the next level. I was immediately suspicious. My parents had never shown any interest in art, let alone in helping me with anything. I told Emily not to accept the offer, that it was a trap, but she didn't want to believe it. She wanted to think that my parents had changed, that they really did want to make amends. A few days later, Emily came to me with tears in her eyes. She told me she'd been having second thoughts about the gallery, about our future. She said my parents had been telling her things that made her doubt our relationship. They'd implied that I was using her, that I was more interested in her money and her success than in her as a person. They'd planted seeds of doubt in her mind, and it was tearing her apart. I was furious. I confronted my parents, demanding that they stay away from us, but they just smiled and played innocent. They said they were only trying to help, that they just wanted what was best for us. I could see through their lies, but Emily was struggling. She didn't know who to believe. The breaking point came when Emily found out about the child. My parents had somehow gotten hold of some medical records, ones that showed I had a child from a previous relationship. I had no idea how they'd gotten this information, but they used it to turn Emily against me. They told her that I was hiding things from her, that I was a liar, and that she couldn't trust me. When Emily confronted me about it, I was shocked. I had no idea what she was talking about. I tried to explain that it was a lie, that I didn't have any other children, but the damage had been done. Emily was hurt, confused, and didn't know what to believe. It wasn't until a few weeks later that the truth finally came out. My parents, desperate to keep control, had forged the documents. They'd gone to extreme lengths to manipulate Emily, to make her think that I was hiding something from her. When Emily found out, she was devastated. She realized that my parents had been lying to her all along, that they'd been trying to tear us apart. But that wasn't the end of it. When my parents realized that their plan had failed, they became desperate. They started making threats, first subtle, then more direct. They told Emily that if she didn't leave me, they'd make sure she lost the gallery, that they'd ruin her reputation and take away everything she'd worked for. They even hinted that they might harm our unborn child if she didn't do what they wanted. Emily was terrified, but she didn't back down. She recorded one of the conversations with my parents, where they threatened her and the baby. She showed it to me, and I knew we had to take action. We couldn't let them get away with this. We decided to sue my parents for harassment, fraud, and emotional distress. We hired a lawyer, a tough-as-nails woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in cases like ours. Sarah was brilliant, and she quickly gathered all the evidence we needed to build a strong case. We had the forged documents, the recordings of the threats, and even surveillance footage from the gallery showing my parents sneaking in when they thought no one was watching. The trial was intense. My parents hired a high-priced legal team, determined to fight the charges. They tried to paint me as the ungrateful son who was trying to destroy his loving parents out of spite. They claimed that everything they'd done was out of love, that they were only trying to protect Emily and the baby. But Sarah was relentless. She presented the evidence with precision, tearing apart their lies one by one. The forged documents were a smoking gun, but it was the recordings that really sealed their fate. Hearing my parents' cold, calculating voices threatening Emily and the baby was chilling, and it left no doubt in the jury's mind about their true intentions. As the trial went on, more shocking details came to light. My parents had a history of manipulation and deceit, stretching back years. They'd conned family members out of money, blackmailed business associates, and even sabotaged my father's own siblings to get what they wanted. Their web of lies unraveled in front of everyone, and their facade of being respectable, loving parents crumbled. In the end, the jury found them guilty on all counts. They were sentenced to prison for their crimes, and the judge issued a restraining order, ensuring that they would never come near us again. It was a bittersweet victory. I was relieved that they were out of our lives for good, but it hurt to know that my own parents could be so cruel, so willing to destroy everything I cared about just to maintain control. After the trial, Emily and I tried to pick up the pieces. The stress of everything had taken a toll on her, and she went into premature labor. Our baby girl, Lily, was born a few weeks early, but she was healthy and strong. Holding her in my arms for the first time, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. It was a reminder of what really mattered, of the life that Emily and I had fought so hard to protect. We decided to leave Singapore after that. There were too many bad memories, too many ghosts from the past. We moved to a quiet town in New Zealand, where we could start fresh and build a life away from the chaos. Emily reopened her gallery, and I took a step back from the corporate world, choosing to focus on my family instead. Life in New Zealand was different, simpler, quieter. It was exactly what we needed. Lily grew up surrounded by love, far away from the darkness that had once threatened to tear us apart. Emily and I were stronger than ever, and we found a new sense of purpose in raising our daughter and supporting each other's dreams. As for my parents, they remained in prison, serving out their sentences. I never visited them, never spoke to them again. They were a part of my past that I was determined to leave behind.